Hey guys, Dimension Master Studios here. How y'all doing? So when it comes to Ninjago, we've gotten a lot of villains over the years, some good and some bad. But in today's video, I wanted to go over who is, in my opinion, the most unique Ninjago antagonist of all time, with that being Unagami, the main villain of Season 12. So, let's get into this whole thing. So, when it comes to Unagami, I feel like in comparison to a majority of the villains that we've gotten when it comes to the franchise, he is one of the most unique villains that we've ever gotten. Starting off with the season that he's in, Prime Empire, and the way that Unagami is handled in this season. Remember, when it comes to Prime Empire, it is a season based around video games, and that is something that we actually see with Unagami. Given the fact that during the season, we don't really see that much of him. He makes a few appearances early on during the season, but even then, we only see him in hologram form, and we do see him in a flashback at one point, but we don't physically see Unagami until the final 2 episodes of the season. And this is something that I feel honestly works really well, given the video game aesthetic of Prime Empire. Because, as we learned during the season, Unagami is meant to represent the physical embodiment of the Prime Empire game. And as we see during the season, the characters need to get the Kitanas in order to get access to the final level of the game, which is where they have to fight against Unagami, which would also make him the final boss of the game. And this right here, I think, honestly makes Unagami's role in the season work really well as the antagonist of a video game focused season, given that we don't get a chance to physically see him until the end of the season, meaning we don't see him until the end of the game. This would be the case for a lot of old school video game bad guys, given the fact that when it came to the final boss of a lot of old school video games, especially arcade games, you often wouldn't get a chance to physically see them until you reach the final level of the game and you were fighting against the final boss. So when it comes to Unagami, with him being the final boss of the Prime Empire game, it makes sense that we wouldn't see that much of him until the very end of the season. And that's already something that I think is pretty cool. However, that's not all, because we also see another big staple of video game bosses with Unagami, and that is the various forms that he takes. When it comes to Unagami, just like a lot of video game bosses, Unagami has the ability to take on multiple forms. There's the first form that we see him in for a majority of the season, with him essentially appearing in this wizard-like form. There's the second form that he takes during his fight against Jay, where he transforms into a dragon. And finally, there is his third and final form that we see for the remainder of the show, with him being a child. And this is something that I would consider to be Unagami's true form, given that, again, this is the version of Unagami that we see for the remainder of the show. And this really heavily connects into a major aspect of Unagami's character, but I'm going to get back to that later on. But still, overall, when it comes to Unagami's actual role and the way he's handled in Prime Empire as a video game focused antagonist, is something that I think honestly works really well during the season. So, moving on from this, let's now discuss the first big moments that we get with Unagami during the season. The first time when we get a chance to see Unagami happens during Okino's story, when Okino learns that he's just a character inside of a video game. And Unagami reveals that, yes, this is the case, he is just a character inside of a game. However, Unagami reveals that he's trying to find a way to go to the real world, and if Okino lets the ninja die during their quest to get the first Kitana, then Unagami will take him to the real world. However, Okino ultimately chooses to fight back against Unagami, and he reveals the location of the weak spot of the Red Dragon, thus allowing the ninja to defeat it and get the first Kitana. And Unagami, enraged by this, ultimately chooses not to bring Okino to the real world. And something that I think is really interesting about this is what we learn about Unagami later on during the season. Where later on during the season, we see that when it came to Unagami, his creator, Milton Dyer, shut down the Prime Empire project after Unagami trapped Scott inside of the Prime Empire video game. And when it came to Milton Dyer, he essentially ended up abandoning Unagami out of the anger that he felt as a result of what Unagami had done. And when it comes to Unagami, he's essentially doing to Okino what Milton Dyer did to him, with both of these characters getting angry at essentially their sons and ultimately abandoning them out of their anger. And I feel like you could make the argument that when it comes to Okino, and by extension the rest of the NPCs in Prime Empire, they are essentially the children of Unagami in a way, given the fact that Unagami is the physical embodiment of the Prime Empire game itself. But again, the general idea still holds true of a father figure essentially abandoning their child as a result of the anger that they felt towards them. So when it comes to Unagami, he's essentially continuing on with the cycle that Milton Dyer started. However, unlike Unagami, Okino didn't feel any anger or vengeance towards Unagami, and he was ultimately able to come to terms with the fact that he was a character inside of a video game. So while Unagami was able to continue with the cycle that Milton Dyer started, Okino in a way was able to break that cycle by not going down the same path that Unagami did, which I think is honestly pretty interesting. However, going back to the playtest, I feel like this scene right here does a good job at representing one of the big questions that Prime Empire asks, and it's the question, is a creator responsible for its creation's actions? This is something that we do get during the playtest with Scott going into the Prime Empire game, and the question ultimately becomes, who's really responsible for this happening? Milton Dyer or Unagami? Yes, Unagami is the one who asked Scott, would you like to enter Prime Empire, and Scott ultimately chose to go into the Prime Empire machine, but you need to remember, the only reason why Unagami did that in the first place was because of his programming and the way that Milton Dyer made him. Remember, Milton Dyer made Unagami in order to give the players the greatest gaming experience of all time, so when it came to Unagami, he was essentially just following his programming that, as we learned during the season, was not fully completed. So again, the question ultimately becomes, who's really responsible for what happened to Scott here? Was it Milton Dyer because he created Unagami the way that he did, or was it Unagami for acting on his programming that Milton Dyer created, even though said programming was not complete? Again, it is a big question here. Is the creator responsible for his creation's actions? However, that's not it, because there's one other major question that Prime Empire asks that also relates into Unagami and Milton Dyer, with the question being, is artificial life actual life? This is something that we also get with characters like Okino and Racer 7, but it mainly applies to Milton Dyer and Unagami. Considering the fact that during the season, we learned that Milton Dyer ultimately shut down the Prime Empire project, and he never gave Unagami a proper explanation behind what was going on. And the reason why Milton Dyer never did this is because he didn't consider artificial life to be actual life. He didn't think that an AI program had the ability to feel emotions, so he ultimately shut down the project and never gave any proper explanation to Unagami behind what was going on, because he didn't think Unagami was capable of feeling any kind of emotion. However, as we know, that ultimately was not the case, because Unagami ended up becoming really angry at Milton Dyer for shutting down the project and never giving him any proper explanation behind what was going on. And when it comes to Milton Dyer, he ultimately realizes that he was wrong about artificial life not being actual life, because during the final episode, he ultimately comes to the realization that what he did was wrong, and that when it comes to Unagami, he is essentially his son, and he ultimately gives Unagami the answers that he had been looking for so long. And that's something else interesting about Unagami that I want to bring up, and it's that when it comes to his motive, it isn't really anything that cruel or malicious. Unlike most other Ninjago villains whose main overall goal is something like world domination, the desire to get power, or getting revenge on someone, this is something that we don't really get with Unagami. Yes, he does want to get payback on Milton Dyer, however, it's not to the same level of other revenge-driven characters like Asphira or Moro, for example, because when it comes to Unagami, the main thing that he wants above all else from Milton Dyer is answers. He wants to know why he was created, and he wants to know why the Prime Empire project was shut down. These were questions that Unagami had, however, Milton Dyer wasn't giving him the answers that he wanted. Despite all the confusion and chaos that was going on, the only thing that Unagami wanted above all else was answers. And I honestly feel like with Unagami's main overall desire being to get answers for certain things, I honestly feel like this ends up humanizing Unagami in a really interesting way, mainly because of just how relatable this is. Because when it comes to really confusing and chaotic times, naturally people are gonna want answers as to what's going on. And if you don't get those answers, then it's something that can be really confusing and frustrating for people. So when it comes to Unagami, him wanting answers is something that I think is really interesting and humanizes him in a way that I feel we haven't really seen with most other Ninjago villains. However, something that I feel makes Unagami's backstory and his whole situation all the more tragic is when you take into account the fact that when it comes to Unagami, he's basically a kid. As we see when it comes to Unagami, like I said earlier, his true form is essentially that of a child, showing that when it comes to Unagami, he is essentially Milton Dyer's son. And remember, Milton Dyer essentially ended up abandoning Unagami and never gave him a proper explanation for what was going on. And so when you think about it, when it comes to Unagami, he's essentially a little kid who was abandoned by his dad and never had any parental figure in his life. So when it comes to Unagami lashing out at the world the way that he does, it's the only thing he knows how to do because no one was ever there in order to teach him what to do and what not to do. It's really the only thing that he knows. However, when Unagami does finally reunite with Milton Dyer, he's ultimately able to realize the error of his ways, and he realizes that what he's been doing is wrong. And all this relates into Unagami's defeat that we get right at the end of the season, which I think is honestly a really solid defeat, mainly because of how different it is compared to most other Ninjago villain defeats. For the most part, when it comes to Ninjago villains getting defeated, there's usually some big battle where the big bad is ultimately defeated and the ninja come out victorious. However, this time around, we don't necessarily get that, because instead of there being one gigantic fight, although we do get that right beforehand, this time what we get is Jay, Milton Dyer, and Unagami all talking to one another. And when it comes to Unagami and Milton Dyer, the stuff that we get between the two of them I think is honestly really interesting, and it's able to properly conclude what we've been seeing with these two over the events of the season. When it comes to Milton Dyer, he's ultimately able to realize the error of his ways, with him finally being able to realize that artificial life is actual life, and he's able to accept Unagami as his son. Finally realizing that essentially abandoning his son and never giving him any proper explanation was not a good thing to do, and Milton Dyer is finally able to give Unagami the answers to the questions that he has had for so long. Meanwhile, when it comes to Unagami, he's able to get the answers that he had been looking for so long, with him finally learning why he was created and what his purpose was, and he's ultimately able to realize the error of his own ways and realizing what he had been doing was wrong. And remember, when it comes to Unagami, he had essentially been lashing out at the world. He didn't really realize that everything that he had been doing was wrong. Especially since, again, when it comes to Unagami, he's essentially a kid. And it's like Jay said during the final episode,
he doesn't seem evil to me, just confused. He doesn't understand what he's doing.
And given that Unagami, again, is a kid, with him lashing out the way that he did, remember, basically the only reason why he was doing that is because he didn't have a dad growing up. But now, when it comes to Milton Dyer and Unagami, the two of them are finally able to reconcile and reunite, meaning that when it comes to Unagami, he's finally being able to be reunited with his dad after so long, and he's able to start a brand new life as a result of that. And after Unagami realizes the error of his ways, not only does he release all the players who are stuck inside the Prime Empire game, but he also gives the NPCs the choice to travel to the real world, thus allowing all of them to start new lives, the exact same thing that Unagami is getting in this moment. And so the season comes to an end with Jade telling the other ninja that when it comes to Unagami, he's where he belongs. He's home, and the last scene that we get of the season is Unagami and Milton Dyer holding hands and walking off into the sunset, with father and son finally being reunited. And honestly, as a conclusion for not just Unagami and Milton Dyer, but really Prime Empire in general, I honestly think it works really well, considering that this wraps up all the major stuff that we have been seeing with Unagami and Milton Dyer over the events of the season. With Unagami finally getting what he had been looking for so long, the answers that he wanted, while Milton Dyer was ultimately able to realize the error of his ways, while also helping Unagami realize that he was also wrong, and the two of them were able to reconcile and reunite. And again, as a conclusion for Unagami, honestly, I think it works really well during the season. But finally, there's one last thing about Unagami that I want to go over when it comes to this video, and that is his dynamic with Jay. Now, we don't really see Jay and Unagami interacting that much during the season, but the few moments that we do get with the two of them, I think is honestly something really interesting, mainly because when it comes to Unagami, he essentially represents an evil version of Jay, but in one key aspect. When it comes to Unagami, he effectively represents a version of Jay who wasn't able to come to terms with things with his parents. Remember, back during Skybound, we learned that Jay was adopted by Ed and Edna, with his biological parents, Cliff Gordon and the previous Elemental Master of Lightning, ultimately abandoning him at Ed and Edna's junkyard. And after Jay learned about this during Skybound, he took some time getting used to this and adjusting to everything that was going on, and he wasn't too sure about what this meant for him. However, Jay was ultimately able to come to the realization that just because he was adopted, that doesn't change anything about who he is. And he was able to come to terms with the situation, and he was still able to accept and see Ed and Edna as being his parents, even if they weren't his biological parents. He was still fine with that, and he was able to come to terms with it. And when it comes to Nagami, he essentially represents a version of Jay that could have potentially gone down a dark path if he wasn't able to come to terms to that. And if Jay had potentially been fixating on stuff when it came to his parents, more specifically though his mom, the previous Elemental Master of Lightning, it's entirely possible that when it came to Jay, he could have ended up similar to Unagami, with him fixating on wanting to find out about what was going on. However, when it came to Jay, like I said, this ultimately didn't happen, with him coming to terms with what was going on, and during Prime Empire, Jay even says that when it came to him being adopted by Ed and Edna, and him essentially being abandoned by his parents, he doesn't know why that happened, but he always figured that there was a reason. And even if he doesn't know what that reason was, he always figured that there was some reason behind what was going on. And not only that, Jay is also able to help Unagami realize that when it comes to this hyperfixation on everything going on with Milton Dyer, it was ultimately doing him more harm than good, both in terms of harming Ninjago, but also harm to himself as well, considering again that hyperfixation on wanting to figure out what was going on with Milton Dyer. And so, interestingly enough, while Unagami represents what could have happened to Jay if he wasn't able to come to terms with stuff with his parents, in a way, Jay also represents what Unagami would ultimately end up like once Unagami and Milton Dyer were finally able to reconcile and the two of them were finally able to reunite with one another, with Unagami finally being able to let go of that hyperfixation surrounding stuff with Milton Dyer. And something that's even more interesting is that in the Quest for the Lost Powers book, during Jay's story in the book, the two of them actually have their roles reversed, because in the book, Jay's the one who's actually going through the struggles surrounding stuff with his parents, while Unagami is the one who's able to help Jay through his struggles. And it's actually with the two of them bonding over the events of the book, and Jay being able to work through those family struggles thanks to Unagami, Jay is actually able to regain his elemental powers, and by the time Jay's story comes to an end, he ends up viewing Unagami as a brother. And so I feel like when it comes to Jay and Unagami, the dynamic that we get between these two is honestly really interesting, considering what we end up seeing with their families. And when it comes to Jay and Unagami, again, Unagami essentially represents what Jay could have ended up like if he wasn't able to come to terms with stuff with his parents, while Jay represents what Unagami would ultimately become when Unagami was finally able to reunite with Milton Dyer and let go of those hyperfixations. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. Overall, when it comes to Nagami, again, I think that he is one of the most unique Ninjago villains that we have ever gotten. Given stuff like his role during the season, his dynamics with the other characters, mainly Milton Dyer and Jay, the questions that Unagami ties into during Prime Empire, I think there's honestly a lot of genuinely interesting and compelling things when it comes to Unagami. And in my opinion, when it comes to Unagami, I think that he is one of the best written villains in all Ninjago, considering just how complex of a character he really is. And again, when it comes to Unagami, I honestly think that he is the most unique Ninjago villain that we've ever gotten. And although I'm not entirely sure if we are going to see him again at some point, I would really like to see Unagami return at some point and for the show to expand upon his story. Hopefully that does happen at some point during Dragon's Rising, but we're just going to have to wait and see. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. So tell me down below what do you guys think. Tell me what are your guys' thoughts when it comes to Unagami. Again, tell me down below and I hope you guys enjoy. Later guys, this is Dimension Master Studios, signing off.